So what I'd like to do is I have this 8-foot long piece of pine, and I'd like to rip it in half. I'm going to use a narrow curved blade in the table saw. This board is a little more than 3/4 of an inch thick. I should end up with two boards that are nearly 3/8 of an inch thick, which is what I'm looking for. The middle, where the saw kerf is, doesn't have to be perfectly clean, but I want it to be as good as I can get it. For illustrative purposes, I'll talk about this board, even though I'm really doing it to the big long one. So the technique is you set the blade and you run it through, then you flip it end for end, run it through again, then you raise the blade a little bit, run it through, flip it end for end, run it through again, and you keep repeating that. And what happens is the saw kerf creeps in from the top and the bottom toward the middle. And if you use a traditional feather board, it doesn't work because it sits down low and it's going to pinch this saw kerf as you lead up toward the blade, and that's no good. So you really need a feather board that's going to support the piece pretty much right in the middle. So that's why I have the feather board jig here. This board is about 3.5 inches tall, and the feather board is 1 3/4 to 2.5 inches in height. So that lines up pretty well. This piece of pine that I bought at the local box store says made in New Zealand. This literally has traveled halfway across the globe. I think I pretty much live on the opposite side of the planet. So here they are all cleaned up, and they came out great. That's a nice flat cut, and again there's a saw kerf coming in from both sides. Came out very nice. First of all, this is 8 feet long, so I need about 17-18 feet of shop space to be able to run this through. If I orient my table saw just right, I can do that in my crowded shop. One problem I had to solve was I built an outfeed extension beyond my original little outfeed extension. This is so that as the board came off the table saw, I still had enough to support it. And this is specific to my table saw, so there's not a great build video. I built this auxiliary fence, goes on my fence for my table saw. Gives me a little bit more of a support. This fence is reversible. I do have a separate video on that because this turned out to be quite a challenge to get these faces perpendicular. If I had to build another one, I'd probably do it a little differently. And finally, I built this elevated feather board to support the piece in the middle, to hold it against the fence in the area that was not part of the saw kerf. And I probably over-designed and overbuilt this. So far, it's worked quite well. So here's this board, resawn and edge glued. It came out pretty good, Probably took me 20 minutes or so of preparing this edge, and you can feel the joint, you can see the joint, but it's pretty good. And the two halves of the board kind of give you a book-matched effect, which looks fine. One thing I learned from this exercise to pass on is you really do yourself a favor to have both boards the same thickness. I have this little clamping jig to register the two boards and hold them more or less in alignment for the glue up, but you can see there's a gap over here and over here because this board is thinner than this board. So depending on how my next resaw goes, I'll have to see what I'm going to do about that. But the good news is, even with not so great alignment, where this is soft pine, it's relatively easy to surface the faces. Well, I took some extra time to try to make sure that I had the saw kerf right in the middle of the board. Just realize if you're off by 10 thousandths, then one side, perhaps this one, is 10 thousandths smaller. This side, by definition, will be 10 thousandths larger. So any amount that you're not centered, you're effectively doubling the error by the nature of the cut. And despite my best efforts, these boards didn't come out quite as close as I had hoped. But I tried a different clamping technique. I used half of my clamps and I clamped them independently at the top and bottom. And this face at the bottom of the clamp is flat. So by clamping it in this way, the left and right side, the tops can be at different levels, but the bottom should be held in place by the clamp. So here is this particular board. I spent about 5 minutes or so scraping and sanding it, and it came out really good. You can obviously see the seam. There's a couple areas where I think the glue seeped into the wood fibers. If I was going to be staining this, that would be a problem. But this is not a piece of fine furniture. It's just going to be a cover on an opening. Well, that's all I have for now. It's funny how a project that you think is going to take an afternoon ends up taking 2 or 3 weeks. The whole thing started out, I had a project where I was trying to box some things in, and plywood was a good alternative for some of the things I was doing. But I reached a point where the edge grain was going to be exposed, so I needed a solid board, and I felt as though typical 1x stock was just going to be a little too thick, look a little too bulky. I do have a bandsaw, but it's not really set up for doing that kind of a project. I'm more familiar with my table saw, and these thin kerf blades seem to be a good fit for such an application. So the first thing I did was I built an auxiliary fence to give me more support, and then when you resaw, you need a feather board that's up off of the table saw. And in order to build the feather board, I had to build an auxiliary sled for my miter gauge. And of course, to make this jig, you needed a runner, you needed knobs. I needed an extension on my table saw to be able to support the long boards. And once I had them cut, then I had the challenge of how to glue it. I built a few of these simple T-stands to lift it up off the work surface so that I could get clamps on both sides. And I also built these clamping blocks to be able to pinch it on the top and bottom to hold them better in alignment. But the project came out very well, so I'm happy overall. And as always, I appreciate anybody who stops by and checks out my videos, and I hope you picked up some good ideas. I hope the time I spent making these videos was worthwhile, at least to some of you. So thanks again for coming by, and I look forward to sharing more of my videos with you.